welcome everyone. This is episode 189 of Silver Lining for Learning, Higher Education Futures at the Intersection of Hope, Justice, and EdTech. We have George Valencianos, Camille Dixon-Dean, Sakina Haddad, and I'm going to go through their bios briefly with all of you. Before I do that, we're going to talk about a special issue that's not out yet. It's coming. It's in the International Journal of EdTech in Higher Education. Now, George, Camille, Sakina, if you could help me get something accepted in that journal. They tend to desk reject everything I say sent to them again this week. It's a great journal, and it's open access. And it's really a thriving journal. It's a highly ranked one. So we're going to be probing this special issue with all three of you. George, I've known for 20 years almost, right? George, he almost became my student here at Indiana when he was at Minnesota getting another degree. He decided to stay at Minnesota and get his PhD there. And now he's back as a professor at Minnesota. He can't get enough of Minnesota. I don't know what someone from Cyprus wants to deal with all that cold weather, but maybe climate change and global warming, does wonders for one's body. He was the Canadian Research Chair of Innovative Learning and Technology, as well as the Commonwealth of Learning Chair in Flexible Education. He now is the chair, the Bonnie Westby Hubner Chair in Education and Technology. He's an expert in online learning. He's an expert in adventure learning. He has 100+ publications. He has a number of books out there, including one on digital scholarship, and also one on the online student experience called Learning Online. And one of these books is freely available. Maybe George will talk about that in a second. But he's done a lot of other things, including thinking about the future and banding people together from around the world to think about that future along with him. Camille Dixon-Dean is on the editorial board of ETRND, EdTech Research and Development, as well as the Internet in Higher Education. I've had the privilege of doing special issues for ETRD and now working on Internet in Higher Ed. Camille has also helped with EDUCAUSE's Horizon Report, which is probably one of the most read reports in the entire field of education. We look upon this with keen interest every year. We always learn something from it. Sakina is an educational researcher working at the intersection of psych, my old field, learning science, and education. She has the broad goal of translating research and educational practice underpinned by equity and social justice. Her research lives at the intersection of that psych, education, learning science, and digital design methods. It's a lot like my bio. We probably need to move on to let them explain what I didn't include in that. And maybe we'll start with George, go to Camille, and then Sakina, and then we'll get into the special issue. George, why don't you take over?
Thank you, Kurt, for that very generous introduction. But yeah, I'm George.
Oh no, I didn't even say half the stuff. I could have said he was in Manchester.
You don't need to say anything more.
He was at UT Austin. He was on Vancouver Island. He's been everywhere, right?
I appreciate that. So I'm at the University of Minnesota now in the Learning Technologies program, which is within the College of Education and Human Development. And I should also say that two of our colleagues who co-edited this issue with us are not here today. It's Shindell Holden, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Railroads University in Victoria, BC, and Jen Ross, who is at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Lots of people, lots of different time zones. Even for us all to get together, it was challenging at times to trying to figure out this special issue. I'll turn it to Camille if she wants to add something about herself, and then Sakina, and we'll go from there.
Okay, hi all, Camille Dixon-Dean. I was in the US for a while. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and now I'm in Australia. There, I am leading the research program in engineering in a school called Professional Practice and Leadership, where surprisingly, and they're allowing me to do this, surprisingly, they're allowing me to put an intersection between so many fields. EdTech is one of them, engineering education is another, and then we call the IT part of it and the learning and the performance part of it. So we call it professional practice, and then we add the management on top. So it's a very intersectional space from an engineering perspective where we don't really talk about this space in engineering education. So I lead the research part there, that faculty level organization there. I'll hand it over to Sakina and then we can get this going. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I just like to first acknowledge that I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, presently known as Brisbane, Australia, and just would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And as we talk about higher education futures at the intersections of justice, hope, and EdTech, I'd like to acknowledge the centrality of liberation of Indigenous people worldwide. As you know, colonization is not just historical with intergenerational consequences still ongoing, but that colonization is a present phenomenon in many parts of the world today. My background, as you said, Kurt, has gone through quite a bit of a journey. So I started from psychology, and in fact, very, very experimental psychology. So I was, in labs, just computing and coding. Experiments in cognition and emotion. And then I went to Griffith University and worked on strategic learning and teaching stuff, where I was also the academic lead for learning analytics and learning sciences. And now I find myself in teacher education. And so, a lot of the things from my, I guess, academic and professional trajectory has come to pass as I think about implications for, not just higher education students, but also children who are going to be our future, and, really positioning teachers as educational change makers in that sense. So the work with my colleagues here has been really interesting in that sense.
And I'll just jump in.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Dee Dee from Harvard University. Those of you listening to this as a podcast probably didn't know I was here, but I'm part of the mix and looking forward to talking about online learning.
Yeah, apologies, Chris. We normally introduce everyone in the show on the front end, especially for people out running trails, listening to the podcast later or in your cars. Please promote the show, all episodes, to your friends. We'll give you just a general overview kind of question to start us off with, and anyone can jump in. What prompted the special issue, and was your goals for it?
Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the history and how it came together, and then turn it over to Camille and Sakina to talk about sort of the content, but sort of the goals of it. Maybe a year and a half ago or so, the five of us and a few other colleagues started talking about pursuing a large-scale multi-country grant on education futures. And so invited lots of folks in and started, trying to figure out what the grant should be about, what people are interested in, how it aligns with their research areas, what our hopes for it are, that sort of thing. And through that process and sort of, trying to flesh out this grant, we thought that doing a special issue and collaborating on one together would maybe get us sort of closer together in aligning what the aims of this grant would be. So that's kind of how we took that big idea of multi-million, multi-year grant into something sort of smaller to figure out, okay, what is the crux of this thing? And we sort of landed at that, the intersection of justice, hope, EdTech in higher education. And maybe Camille or Sakina, would you like to talk a little bit more about the goals of the special issue from there?
Before they jump in, I'll just mention I was in the first meeting, and it was a big group. And Punya, our podcast partner, Punya Mishra, was part of it and did continue with your group and contributed to the issue. So that's great to see. So would someone like to jump in? Yeah, Camille.
Yeah. Well, when George graciously offered us all to join this, it was because I do a lot of writing in terms of what is socially just in terms of the design of learning. And here in Australia, they call it learning design, as whereas where I came from in the US, they call it instructional design. And we have this pulling and tugging of what the terminology should be and what the meaning of it behind it is. Through my work in understanding not just the meaning and the terminology, but understanding how it's done and the traditions behind how instructional or learning design, as it may, is formed. We're just missing some steps in terms of what Sakina intimated about the colonizing of our field and the colonizing of education on the whole. In terms of one of the biggest things I talked about is just participant characteristics. How do we define we define participants? Participants are not allowed to define who they are when we collect data. So little things about that kind of been disturbing me over the couple of years. I've written a couple of pieces here and there. And George's invitation came about that time, and it just created a really good pathway to investigate this a little further. Sakina, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely agree with all of that. And yes, for me, it was through George's generosity and just opening up, possibilities, which is very much also the ethos of this special issue, I think, because one of the things that really became quite imperative, particularly, kind of catalyzed by COVID-19, there's this much bigger and widespread awareness of the bias of knowledges that we kind of accept as the norm, and I guess realizing that there is not enough questioning of what we know and why we know what we know. And so one of the things that I think was really central in bringing this special issue together is to kind of allow and enable generative possibilities with regards to, thinking about new methods and methodologies and rethinking why we know what we know and how we might perhaps forge more hopeful, radically hopeful futures given new methods. And a lot of that comes with, I guess, challenging a lot of the presuppositions of different fields as we bring, that interdisciplinary view of hopeful futures of higher education.
So to maybe make it like a little bit concrete for our readers, what we or our listeners, what we wanted people to do was to come to this special issue, so prospective authors, and imagine what higher education futures look like when they're not constrained by, the powers that be. And powers that be is sort of a broad term to say, things like large EdTech companies or consultants that try to shape the future. So we essentially invited people to imagine broadly, unconstrained by methods. We're open to all kinds of methods, all kinds of disciplines, and then just go from what we received, right? So the end product is basically what people sort of submitted.
So Chris is unmuted. Did you want to jump in here?
Well, I just want to talk a little about the multidimensionality of higher education's future. So I find that I spend a lot of time thinking about the shift from formal education to lifelong learning. And that's one kind of future where we say higher education shouldn't be all about preparing you for your first job. It should be a gateway, higher and continuing education, to preparing people for self-directed lifelong learning. I also think about next generation massive learning. So MOOCs were a failed attempt to have a good aspirational vision in terms of people all across the world working where they wanted and what they wanted. I don't think that the next generation of massive learning is MOOCs. I think that we are beyond that in terms of our instructional designs and learning designs and so on. So that's another dimension of the future. And then what I'm hearing you say is it's about agency, sort of another dimension of the future where students have agency, universities have internal agency based around knowledge and research rather than based around societal mandates and corporate entities. So it obviously all of the future directions of higher education are too complex to put in a single issue, but I'm curious as to whether I'm capturing some of what you're talking about when I talk about agency or whether that's off target.
I could step in here if you guys don't mind. It is a systemic and a systematic problem that we are trying to broach with this specialist here, and we all come from different spaces of where we would see what we would like to happen and what we're feeling is not happening, and dealing with that empathy in that space of emotions, behavior, and observation. It becomes really important, and I think that's what this issue is trying to get to. It's important for people to stop and think a little more about what they're doing as a practice in the field. I can tell you, you mentioned MOOCs, and I know a lot of MOOCs are still running and still trying to capture that essence of lifelong learning. The new goal is micro-credentialing. It's a great idea. It's coming up. We have all of these micro-credentials going on, but we just don't know how they're going to fit into the system that we have not addressed. So I think what we're trying to get to is the systems and how the systems have been crafted. And Sakina and George have intimated through just the idea of the colonizing of the curriculum, the knowledge that we have, that we were meant to think one way about what we do, as opposed to really stopping and going, is that the right way? And should we deconstruct that a little more and make it a little more meaningful for the people who have to do the work? I think that's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Yeah, may I add to that as well? Because I absolutely am with you, Camille, too. And I think one of the systems and systematic aspects of that, as Chris was also pointing out, that perhaps universities have some internal agency with that. And I think a lot of what the special issue is tries to do, as well as I think the researchers in the field that's trying to do, is to exercise sort of like an out-of-the-box level of courage, right? That it brings the meaning of agency to the next level, that you want to exercise these highly complex processes of cognitions and emotions that's highly, completely tied in every single person in various ways. That challenges what we know to disrupt the status quo, because we understand the status quo is not quite right. But some of the really cool things that a lot of the researchers here have done is really help untangle through their imaginative and creative methods how we problematize the status quo, even, so that we can forge that courageous agency for hopeful futures.
That's helpful for me. And I'm, again, I'll try one more rephrasing and I'll get out of the way. But it sounds, some of what I'm hearing is that there's a one-size-fits-all knowledge model that is primarily preserving things as they are, preserving the status quo, and that you would like to see, and rightly so, knowledge is being like an ecosystem with many different niches and with alternative, epistemological and axiological approaches to it. And the status quo isn't very comfortable with that. So how do we get past that? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's a fair summary. I think agency is really important here. Just going back to the prior question, but there's also this idea of futures plural, right? We intentionally called it Higher Education Futures because we would like sort of people to come to the realization that there is no single future that we're all sort of headed towards, and that there are multiple futures possible, and that actions that we take today shape what the futures look like. And if people start, I mean, lots of people imagine the future and speculate what the future looks like. But our colleague Jen Ross, who wrote a book on speculative methods, what she argues is that when we speculate the future and imagine what it could look like, that speculation isn't just an exercise in, imagination, or an exercise in writing or science fiction or what have you. It's an exercise in what we value today. So if we imagine that the future of higher education involves, say, systemic surveillance, and we think that that future is dystopian and we don't want to be there, that gives us some hints on what we should do today to prevent us from getting to that future, right? So the work of speculating about the future is very informative to what actions we can take today, to either come to hopeful futures or avoid sort of negative, dystopian, whatever have you futures.
So on a couple of days ago, I got an email from someone named Jonah at University of Michigan. He's a freshman. Wants to chat about his future. Wants to chat about why he should be in higher education and all this. So eventually we did get to chat a couple of days later, a day later. And he was asking me questions, that Camille just raised about, these alternative educational paths that are in front of us, be it, micro-credentials, and the acceptability of that within higher education, or why isn't it acceptable or as widely as it could be, and why is higher education so resistant to new forms and structures of educational delivery? Because he doesn't think the costs are worth it today for him and his colleagues, his friends. And he's disappointed with where things are. I think he's in a biology type of major, and he's thinking about taking a year off of school as a result, and probably coming back, but he doesn't know as what and in what and to do what. And he'll spend a year searching and learning outside the higher education systems and structures.
I'm shocked to hear that the success of the football team is not enough to gladden his heart and make him happy about the whole thing.
Or the Jim Harbaugh 15-0 tattoo he got yesterday. So, so I wonder what percent of students in higher education today, or pre-higher education, those in secondary high schools, are contemplating the same thing like Jonah and are troubled. And I wonder what we can do for those people. This podcast show is one venue that they can go to and listen and hear what Camille and Sakina and George had to say. But, I gave him some answers. I was not totally satisfied with what I said, but we had longer conversation than he had asked for. So I think there were some things that I could provide. But what else would you tell a person like that if you were asked some of these questions about the worth of higher education today, and maybe taking a secondary road before going back on the primary road, and how long will it take for those higher education administrators and institutions to see the light, to recognize that things are going to change or have to change, and do something about it?
I would say one thing. I wish Jen was here. I really, really wish Jen was here, because this, I think, is really in her ballpark. And she's quite ahead of the curve in being brave. And I think that's the first thing. You have to be brave and courageous, as Sakina also intimated. Yeah. It's very hard to go up against a system that is well founded and placed as the only avenue that you have. It is really difficult. In my role, I allow students to do research, and I break the norm with ethics. I break the norm with, I'm not unethical. Let me just say that for, I'm not unethical, But I break the norm as to why are we doing what we're doing when we ask for certain things in ethics? Why are we doing what we're doing when we ask students that they have to do research this way in order for it to be validated and valued by our field? And again, that's where Jen would really shine in this podcast going forward. But it's also really, I don't know. I eat a lot of spinach. I don't know if you guys know that analogy with Popeye. I eat a lot of spinach to go forward, and I get a lot of flack. You know, you have to smile. You have to, you know, your skin has to be very thick to support students in their journey going forward, and to say, why can't we do this? What barriers do they have? And I act as a shield most times to break down those barriers and say, yeah, they can do this. What if I were to pay for it? What if I were to stop this? And what if I were to help them with this part of it? I think that's what our field is really calling for us, who are renowned and who have the power and the agency on top of them to help guide and help students make a better future. And I think that's one of the things we can do. We can help catalyze the whole process by what we do every single day.
So Camille, you mean Jen Ross in Edinburgh at the Center for Research in Digital Education, who's part of the special issue. I've had people from Edinburgh write chapters for one of my books, and they're always doing cutting edge things there, it seems like. So
yes, she's very. Both of our teams that members that are missing have much to. Chandel would be another great voice to really leverage in this conversation here, because I think we each in our own way are trying to break those barriers down. And I think we all do it collectively if you look at the things we have done, not only through the special issue, but through our history of our bios. You will see little ways that we have tried to do different things differently. Get into trouble, most of us we do. But we do try to keep pushing and pushing and pushing that narrative. And I think that's what the special issue is, a good way of a good foundation for us to say, hey, we can step on this and say our parts were well with it.
That's a great question, Kurt. I mean, I have some thoughts. Some of them relate to a special issue, some of them don't. But I think one approach that we should be taking when these questions come up, both within and outside of our institutions, is to be honest with the people who ask us about it, right? When people come to me and say, oh, I want to do a PhD because I want to become a professor, I talk to them about the slim likelihood of that happening and how lucky those of us who are faculty are to be in this position, because there's, for every single one who has a position, there are thousands of other brilliant people that could have been, that could have had the same position, right? It's and students don't know that, right? They see that as sort of a natural outcome of doing a PhD. We also know that attending higher education is associated with better health outcomes, but we also know that there's other paths, right? And I'm newly back to the States. The cost of higher education in Canada is not nearly as close to what it is in the States, right? So there's also differences across geographies here. Just to talk a little bit about Canada here, for example, every single student who goes to trade school in Canada is going to find gainful employment, right? And that's another great path. But when I have those conversations with my parents and sister, because my niece and nephew are 16 and 17, they have this sort of image in their head of what a sort of successful adult looks like. And that successful adult ought to have at least an undergraduate degree, right? I grew in a blue-collar family. First in my family to go to college. So the question about trades doesn't even come up, right? They say, well, why would he go he needs to go to university, or she needs to go to university, right? Both of them. So it's Even when I share what I know as someone who's been sort of in this space, it's difficult to get out of that cultural mindset, at least, in my family's case, around like what people need to do after they graduate high school. That's a challenging conversation.
Yeah, I'm actually inspired by a lot of the work that Chandel and George does in terms of critical education and involving EdTech as well. So I know, same as Camille, for us as faculty at the university, we almost have to lead with that courage and just, even if it's scary, to just give it a go, because I think students notice and they do see that. And, when we talk about beyond the job, the value of being a critical civic citizen and a global citizen, what does that mean? And your role in doing that, kind of like opening the ideas of not meeting particular set outcomes, but outcomes that we don't yet know are possible, right? And that's the idea of futuring. So even kind of talking to them about possibilities and encouraging that that mode of thinking, I think does a lot in learning communities as well. And so a lot of these things happen as hidden curriculum sometimes because they have to be because of the systems and systematic constraints that we work within. But again, I wonder what these little steps do to catalyze like future change with students in that way, even in the terms of the view of cultures and norms and what they might end up doing.
So before Chris jumps in with another question, just let me make a quick comment here. Chandel Holden is listed in the bios in the blog for this show, along with Jen Ross. Chandel is at Royal Roads University, where George used to work. So we have a number of people listed in here. We've got 3 with us as guests, live guests today. Chris.
So my late colleague, Clayton Christensen in the Harvard Business School, talked a lot about disruptive innovation, and he wrote a book called Disrupting Class. He mistakenly applied the model to K-12, and he and I had a lot of debates about that. But it is a model that applies to higher education because that is a matter of individual consumers making choices among different providers. And I think those of us who've tried to change higher education through evolutionary innovation, where you try to change 10% one year and 10% another year and so on, the tide comes in and the sandcastle washes away. The system just kills off small changes. Or there's transformative innovation where you bring in a radical and change 40% of the system at one fell swoop, and then you have a war between the old system and the new system, and sometimes one wins, sometimes the other wins. It's always pretty bloody. And his model of disruptive innovation is essentially to start up an alternative off to the side that's initially primarily serves the group that isn't served by the big system or isn't well served. And then over time, it gets better and better and better and just kind of takes over. And some of the battles that we fight are evolutionary or transformative. But I'm wondering if you see examples of disruptive innovation that are happening that you think have the potential to just grow and eventually to become competitive or more than competitive with the traditional model. There's a conference here this weekend that I spoke at yesterday, and the closing keynote is by the president of Minerva University. So that's an example of a kind of disruptive innovation. But I'm curious as to your thoughts about this.
I can give a little one that we use here in Australia. Don't know, Sakina, if Griffith does this. At UTS, we still using the micro-credentialing kind of model. We have kind of dabbled in the idea of stackable degrees or stackable certifications towards a degree. So we're still moving along in that space where the idea where we can stack enough credentials to get a certificate, and then from there towards a bachelor's and moving it onwards. It's slowly taking some kind of movement. I know some faculties are a little more successful than the others, but and I'm putting the word but, then I know that's negating some things there. There's some challenges in that the ecosystem in which it is placed is pushing against it. So Australia's education system differs from the US, differs from Canada, differs from the rest of the world. It's like it's a huge part of the economy. It's seen as a huge line item in government budgets. And most of our students are international, not domestic, they're international. And as a result, doing stackables really works better for domestics than it does for internationals. All right. So we have a bit of a pull and a tug as to the solution that we're adopting and how it works going forward to make it sustainable, to be what I am thinking is both disruptive and transformational. But I'm not sure how we're going to fare in about 2 to 3 years when that budget line begins to go further downwards. If it's going to stick around or if it's going to be like, okay, next tool, next solution. We haven't given it much of a good go, we should say.
A couple of examples from my perspective. I think competency-based education is very interesting and unique and powerful model when done well. And I know there's a couple institutions in the US that work in this space that are quite successful. Whether there's a likelihood to replace the current model, I don't quite know. But I think it deals in a space that institutions have kind of ignored. So it's been able to sort of carve out, at least these institutions have been able to carve out a market, if you will, for lack of a better term here, that serves people and serves them well. I think another space that's really interesting, and this is an old innovation, but there's also some resurgence around it. This idea of sort of do it yourself degrees. The Open University in the UK calls them, an open degree. Where I was, we had bachelor's and master's degrees in interdisciplinary studies, where students would basically enroll and develop their own degree with the assistance of an advisor, right? They would pick courses, they would develop sort of focal areas based on their interests. My earlier institution worked with mid-career professionals, right? So they knew what they wanted. It was fitting within their context, usually their employment context, and they were able to build sort of custom targeted approaches to what they needed. But I think one of the areas where perhaps institutions could innovate is within spaces that they haven't sort of explored in the past. So for example, I see a lot of innovation happening around the arts, around preparing people with sort of skills and knowledge that they engage with within sort of the informal sector, right? So cohort-based courses on all sorts of things that institutions don't necessarily teach, led by people who are sort of professionals. So I wonder what kinds of work institutions could do in that space in collaboration with sort of industry or lots of other folks. That's how I think about this.
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit more insidious, I think, in terms of how the students make sense of the world as current. So thinking about tech as in the wild. And, of course, generative AI has thrown that up in the air as well. But there's always been an issue. So, when we talk about information literacy and bring EdTech into that, that's a huge thing, particularly when we think about equity and justice in the real world. And that's something that universities often purport that we do, right? So we're teaching so that students can flourish in the real world and bring in all of those things. But I don't think that that's been done enough, in particular with regards to the digital world, the digitally embedded world. I guess I usually take the post-digital perspective anyway in that regard. And so you still have curricula that separates them out as opposed to completely thinking about these things as entangled. And so it's really interesting because in one of the initial teacher education courses that I teach, we brought in a real case study from a high school in Brisbane, and that's exactly the sort of issues and questions that the high school students had, because that's their life, right? So they're exposed to all these information out there through social media, and social media now completely also flooded with a lot of disinformation and misinformation. But at the same time, they're still trying to make sense of what's credible, what's real, what's not, but also why is the world operating in this way? And it's because of digital media that opens their eyes up to this. And they notice that the school curriculum is not at all helping them connect the dots and really, help them get a deep understanding of this. And at the same time, there are some researchers and industry people, like Tiara Tanksley from the Connected Learning Lab somewhere in the US, I can't remember where, Timnit Gebru's work, of course, phenomenal in this sense to get people to think about AI literacy and educational technology literacy in ways that's embedded in civic places, like how you position yourselves in the world and how you act and think and so on and so forth. I think that's the big challenge going ahead, especially when we're trying to think about possibilities of, hopeful and just futures with technology.
Chris, did you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah.
No, I just feel as if this is illustrating the many possible futures that come out in the issue, and that it's exciting. I'm looking forward to reading the articles and joining in a dialogue about.
I was just going to say something, Kurt, to what Sakina said, and it just prompted me to say, and I've said this to my students quite often, our foundations are problematic. The problems we have and we are facing today, and we just don't know where to go, is because no one looks or wants to discuss the foundations. I've always asked, why is digital education based off of face-to-face education? Why are our accrediting agencies the same? They're not the same. They shouldn't be the same. Should we ask that question? Should we push that question? A lot of people go, well, no, well, wait, and people get scared really quickly when you ask those kinds of questions. And people are just terrified to say that maybe what we did and what we're continuing to do was flawed because it's built on a flawed foundation. And they're terrified to go into, any step further forward or even backward, because they'll have to admit that there's some flaw in our acknowledgement. And no one wants to write that piece in any paper or any journal article and then be cited against it. No one wants to do that. And one thing I can tell you, we have a subject here called AEI, which is Arguments, Evidence, and Intuition. And we talk about the misuse of data. And we teach that to students, the misuse of data and the misunderstandings behind data. And those are the kinds of things that we have cropping up now that social media is so pervasive across all of our different spectrums. So our foundations, we talk about it, the foundations of what we need to be tackling. And the courage, we don't know how much longer each of our careers will be, but while we are here, that's what we're trying to do with the specialist here. Push that narrative.
And before we go to Kurt, I know you have a number of questions here.
Please jump in here. Yeah, good.
I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that, Chris, you've done this work in the past with your work in scaling up innovations, right? You've argued that it's hard to scale up innovations, and we make the assumption that we're going to produce something and it's going to scale to this every single context out there, regardless of sort of the local realities. So in many ways, this is a very similar call of saying no single innovation is going to scale to solve all of our problems.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and the qualifier I would put in is that it's relatively easy to scale up bad ideas in higher education. Simplistic ideas, unfounded ideas, politically popular ideas, no problem with scaling. But that is the problem, is that something that's complicated enough to actually be an improvement, they don't want to touch it, as you're all saying.
That's so true. I love that.
So I'm going to ask 3 questions I've written down here about the issue itself, but I'm going to ask it in reverse order in which I came up with these questions. So I'll start with the third one first, and the second one, then the first one. It seems like the appropriate point where you should kind of lay out the special issue and tell us some of the articles that are in it and how many are in it and who are some of the authors of it and when is it going to come out? I mean, when should people be looking to the journal itself? Do you have any sense of that? But first, what's in it? What do the 3 of you write?
Great question. Let me take a stab at some of that. So the journal works on a sort of rolling basis. So articles are published as they are accepted. So there's a couple papers already published. One that looks at how indigenous sort of frameworks can work to reframe the role of AI. There's one by Punya Mishra, your colleague here, who sort of uses social science fiction to reimagine some possibilities. There's one by Camille and some our other colleagues, a large team, I think, that looks at an EdTech encyclopedia of sorts and the design principles that were adopted there to sort of make it accessible, flexible, and just. Royce Kimond is involved in that. Araz Boskirk is involved in that. Probably forgetting some other names there. Yeah, I am. I can see Camille sort of shaking her head. Let's see, what else is in there? There's a methods paper that's really interesting by colleagues in Europe that talks about the design agenda for sort of making higher education more wild, if you will, and more sort of unique. They call it rewilding education. And then there's a couple of papers that are still under review that we're just waiting for that last review to come in and put them in there. So I believe by the end of it we'll have 8 papers in the issue, and that should, I'm hoping by next month we'll be done.
So we have had Royce Kimmons on the show before. He was part of EdTech Books. And if anyone wants to listen to another show that we've had on, type in Silver Line for Learning and EdTech Books. It was a great show. I think we've had a Roz Boskert on the show. We were looking at EDUCAUSE Horizon Report, along with John Mason, who will be our guest next week from Darwin, Darwin, Australia. The second question that I have is, you met as a group. I was part of that first meeting. I was in an automobile repair shop, something out in my car that day. So I was kind of all over I listened maybe half of it and half I didn't. But you had many goals, right? And you were brainstorming what you could do as a large group. You came up with the special issue idea. Are you pursuing anything else? And if so, what? And if not, what would you recommend to other people who are forming similar kinds of interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, groups, networks that they might pursue to keep pushing on this important topic?
I would say that we haven't ventured that far yet, but one thing I would say to anyone who's thinking about forging alliances across boundaries, and I call it boundary breaking, and I don't see it as cross-cultural, I see it as cross-contextual, because you can do boundary breaking and still not leave your country. I believe that openness, honesty, and mindfulness is what I approach any of these kind of ventures. And as George intimated, I'm across many of them for many different reasons. I was brought up on an island which was very cosmopolitan in its making. We've been colonized by every single power that there is on the earth, and it has created a country that anything goes at any given time, and we're just very happy about it. And we just know that differences is the power. Differences is a power. It's not something that is meant to be marginalized or militarized or seen as being wrong. And I think that's what our field tends to do with certain words, terms, actions, and beings. And I'm hoping, and I don't know if George and Sakina and Jen listening and Shikana listening, that we keep doing this. We keep pushing that boundary, whether it's to get together separately, apart, or in groups. I think we will continue pushing the boundary because I think it's in all of our hearts to get there.
Chris, did you want? I have a couple of things, but we have 7 minutes left, and maybe Chris wants to jump in here.
No, Kurt, go for it.
Okay, well, one of the logical follow-up, third question that I had is, how would you like professors or administrators to utilize your special issue, and what would you tell graduate students and others about, what your intention were for like the student that called me or I talked to earlier this week? So either people using it for their classes or just people casually listening to this, to this episode and reading it, reading the special issue later. What would you want them to get from your special issue?
I'll add something and then let my colleagues close with their thoughts. One of the things that I would like people to get out of this, whether they're students reading it for their classes or faculty considering it for their courses, is this idea of hope. There's more and more literature speculating on the future of higher education, and a lot of it, if not the majority, is dystopic. Educational technology also has this other problem of being very optimistic, but I think hope is a little bit different than optimism. But we hear very sort of dystopic stories about the future of education, and for good reason. But I think sometimes what those stories do is they tend to foreclose sort of the possibilities for the future, and they tend to shape the ways that we think about the future. And I think that there's reason to be hopeful, and that by telling hopeful stories about the future, we can perhaps take steps now, to generate better futures for ourselves and our students. Faculty who are considering, using stories in their courses about the future of education to prompt, conversations about what that future should look like, what should the technologies that we design today look like, with hope that they, sort of take this notion of hopeful stories as sort of shaping the present.
So that was an excellent answer, and I don't think we need to go beyond that. I think what I'd rather do is give each of you about 30 seconds to tell us what you're currently working on. 30, 45 seconds. We got 3 minutes left in the show. So tell us what you're working on or thinking about working on in the near future. How about we start with Camille?
Well, I'm looking this time because I just came off of a government project working on workforce development and trying to diversify it, gender diversification for energy sectors. So that's what I'm working on at this present time, and it's a very intense project for the next 8 weeks with the government. But we're trying to make sure the energy sector has initially more women in it. And we're talking about the power part of the energy sector in specific.
Sounds great. Sakina.
Yeah, for me, working on I love methodologies and thinking about methodologies, and so I'm working with colleagues on creative-based methods that hopefully will also facilitate healing and restoration in marginalized communities while we think about possible futures. I'm also working on building a possible future by growing an entire human. So that's where I am right now.
Oh, of course. Great. George, you want to wrap us up?
Sure. My current project is in collaboration with my colleague Cassie Sharber at the University of Minnesota, and the Shakopee Metwakanton Shu community here in Minnesota. We are going to be working on a course that intends to help citizens in our state to understand Native peoples of Minnesota and understand their history, the present, and the futures. So it's a course that I'm very excited about. And we're just exploring what that should look like in collaboration with Indigenous people.
I just saw one of our former guests, Kendam Guyback, who's been a guest twice. She presented at the state capitol in Minnesota on the Asia Pacific people of Minnesota. That was interesting. We'll see all of you there in late October when I visit. I want to thank you all for coming. Chris, you want to say thank you?
I want to thank all of you for this special issue and for your work. It is a time when higher education may change dramatically, and we need to have hope. We need to have alternative pathways, and I really appreciate your efforts in that direction.
Exactly. And next week, I can't believe it, is episode 190. We're only 10 episodes from 200. We'll have to have a real special event on that day. But next week, digitally operated one-room schoolhouses for underprivileged out-of-school children. John Mason and his former student Faisal bin Badar and 2 other colleagues of theirs coming from Australia, India, Pakistan, and the US. So it's 7 o'clock Eastern time on April 27th. I hope to see you there.